Folks. I know that yeah, you can see both Andrew and myself. We're just waiting for the room to fill up a little bit more. We've got over 250 people registered for this event this morning, this Valentine's Day 2024. But we're just going to wait a few more minutes to get a number of people. We've got about 50 people rolling in at this point, but I understand the roads have been a little rough this morning in some areas, and so to the extent that people are commuting into the office or from their home, obviously. But we'll just give another minute or two. In the meantime, good morning. I'm Jim Reedy, and we're this is the New Hampshire Tech Alliance HR Exchange, hosted by Sheehan Finney, and I'm thrilled to be with you this morning, and thrilled to be introducing our guest speaker this morning, Andrew Chatfield, and a pretty interesting topic, of course, investigating and dealing with sex harassment in the age of remote work. I saw an interesting statistic that said pre-pandemic, 6% of the U.S. workforce worked remotely. At the zenith of COVID, 66% of the U.S. workforce was remote. And we all remember that scramble for laptops and setting up a home office of sorts and so on, to the extent you didn't have one before, and making do. You know, we're also accustomed to Zoom now, but how many of you knew what Zoom was in March of 2020? And now Zoom seems so antiquated as we move on from Zoom to Teams to other things, and there's also a thing called Zoom fatigue. So, but then of course there was also the push to get people back in the office, and so a lot of push and pull over the last couple of years. But there's one thing that's true, universally true, is our resilience and ability to adapt to change. So we're at the magic hour of 8:02. And so with that, we typically start the program. Again, my name is Jim Reedy. I'm a partner at Sheehan Finney, and I'm thrilled that you folks could be with us today. We are sponsors of the New Hampshire Tech Alliance HR Exchange. And one of the things I did mention with regard to COVID is, as you know, historically, we met in person. But during COVID, obviously, that wasn't necessary. And we found that while we would have 30 to 50 people at our meetings, those breakfast meetings, we actually drew as many as 400 during these virtual conferences, so that we decided to go that route. And it continues to be a very successful platform. So we're thrilled that you could be with us. This is from effectively from 8 to 9:30. Pretty efficient way to use your time in the morning as you start your workday. One of the things that we want to talk about, just as by way of housekeeping, is a few upcoming events. So next month, March 13th, we'll be doing an important topic, one that was not subject to triage largely during COVID, and that was mental health issues. EEOC has been addressing this in guidance recently, and a lot of employers have been dealing with it. But basically, it's having mental health issues come out of the shadows and identifying them and properly dealing with them. And as human resource professionals, I know that this continues to be a stressful issue. And I think also coming out of COVID is that COVID itself amplified mental health issues with its isolation and potentially with other issues like substance abuse disorder. So Jen Meckel is going to be talking about that important topic. April 10th, the National Labor Relations Board does not just simply deal with union workplaces. It also deals with non-union workplaces, as we know. And of course, when there's a shift in the White House from one political party to another, typically there's a shift with the National Labor Relations Board. And Liz Bailey spends a great deal of time on the private and public sector side of labor relations, and she'll be talking to you about some of the more important updates from the National Labor Relations Board in the last couple of years, and what all employers, not just union, but non-union employers, need to know going forward. And in the month of May, we don't do a high-tech HR exchange. We do it in June again to close out the year. But in May, it's our 36th annual Labor and Employment Law Seminar. And we were just talking about that off camera. 36th annual, it's going to be at the Castleton Resort again in Windham, New Hampshire. I believe it is on May 23rd, Thursday the 23rd, the Thursday before Memorial Day. Again, it's our 36th annual, which is amazing. And we are putting together what I think is going to be a terrific agenda for that, full of timely topics. And so stay tuned. We've reserved the day, we've reserved the times, obviously the location, and we'll be sending news out as early as next week and start registration. Typically, that event will sell out. The room holds about 325 people, and we sell out as early as April. Um, in fact, sometimes even earlier than that. So stay tuned. One more housekeeping issue to mention before we get the program started. And this program, like all of our HR exchange programs, comes with HR credits. And those are available at you'll see those in the last slide. But for those that don't retain the slide or and the like, Liz Tesic is terrific about sending an email along with a copy of the program and, yes, a copy of the video presentation um, after the program concludes. So you'll be getting that. And I think that's what I have for housekeeping, except to say if you've got questions throughout, Andrea can take those questions. And one of the questions you may be asking at this point is, Jim, what's wrong with your voice? And I will say that I have not started smoking. Nor do I yell at a dog. It's something that's been going around that a lot of people have gone around. And for some people, it's a blessing when I lose my voice. So I don't know, Andrea, you can speak to that, but I'm going to be turning the program over to someone who has a very strong and convincing voice, and that is Andrea Chatfield, who's not only a good friend, but also my partner. And I've known Andrea for many years, and we're thrilled that both she and Jen Meckel and others from the Cook Little firm joined our firm a couple of years ago. And it's a great addition to our firm in many regards. Andrea is going to be talking to you today about the issue of, because it's Valentine's Day, and this is something we prepare for every year, is the issue of not romance, genuine romance, but the unwelcome advances. And one of the things that I just mentioned briefly, which was in the area of remote work. I think EEOC said, and Andrea, you can speak to this, but 1/3 to 1/2 of sex harassment claims in recent years originated electronically. And so that means the handheld devices or laptops and so on. So certainly a changing environment in that regard, but no less important to deal with. In fact, I think the stakes are even higher, and Andrea certainly can speak to that. And Andrea, as we turn this over, one of the other events that I'd like you to talk about briefly as you start your program is the Granite State HR Conference. Andrea is our representative on the New Hampshire State HR Council, and she and others have been working tirelessly to put together this year's Granite State HR Conference, which is a little bit different than last couple of years. A new location, a new date. Andrea, can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. And happy Valentine's Day. And if you don't have a Valentine, just think you don't have to buy somebody a gift, buy yourself a gift and get yourself some chocolates. But thank you, Jim, for that. And yeah, I've been thrilled that we are part of She Infinity now. It's been over a year, believe it or not. And it's been wonderful to be a part of She Infinity. But yeah, this is going to be a really busy spring and a great time for HR folks and business leaders to get really good education and good information and updates about what's going on in the world of HR and the world of employment law. And what Jim mentioned was the Granite State HR Conference. We're back and we're better than ever, as we like to think. But the State Council, the HR State Council, is working really hard, putting together a great program. It's going to be a 2-day event. It'll be on April 10th and 11th. It will start in the afternoon of the 10th so that you can still attend the HR Tech Exchange, HR Exchange for the Tech Alliance on the morning of April 10th. And then we're going to be hosting the conference up in North Conway, New Hampshire, in the beautiful White Mountains area. So it'll be at the North Conway Grand Hotel. And will start in the afternoon. We're going to have a legal update. We're going to have a deep dive into AI, both from the legal and technical perspective. We're going to have the following day on April 11th will be a full day program. Lots of great breakout sessions about managing remote workers, about ethics in HR, and a whole lot of other things, and some really great keynote speakers. We're so excited that Johnny C. Taylor, who is the president of SHRM, he will be a keynote speaker on the morning of the 11th. And and one thing a question I've gotten, you don't have to be a SHRM member to attend the Granite State HR conference. It's open to everybody. But if you want to hear a really, really dynamic speaker, Johnny C. Taylor is a great speaker. Our last keynote of the day is going to be Amanda Grapponi, who is a fantastic, she's spoken to the Tech Alliance events in the past, and she is a really great dynamic CEO. So that's the Granite State HR Conference. If you're interested in registering, we have a great room rate this year. The North Conway Grand is giving us a room rate of $99 a night, which is fantastic. And there's also going to be lots of fun activities. We're going to have yoga in the morning. We're going to have some hiking. There's going to be a book group discussion. So there's a lot of interesting things. If you are interested in registering for that, you can go to you can Google Granite State HR Conference, or you can go to gshrconference.org to register. And while you're there, if there is somebody you know who you think is a deserving HR hero, we are also, the nominations for the HR Hero Award are opened up, and you can go to the conference website and look at the tab that says HR Hero Award. If you want to nominate somebody, the forms are on the website for that. And we'll be announcing the 2024 HR Hero Award winner at the conference, at the Granite State HR Conference. So certainly if there's somebody that you think is really gone above and beyond in the HR profession, please consider nominating them for an HR Hero Award, and you can go to the conference website and kill two birds with one stone. Okay, so that is enough of the commercials. Think of this as public radio or public TV. You get all your commercials up front. Now I'm going to get the whole program. So I'm going to be talking about remote work and and harassment issues and prevention of harassment. So the reason why we really wanted to do something like this is because remote work is here to stay. As probably you might have guessed, I'm working from home today. I've got my Grand Canyon background. Jim is working from home, and a lot of people work from home nowadays, and it's actually become quite a attractive feature to a lot of positions. A lot of times in job ads, if you see that this is a remote or a hybrid remote position, those tend to get more applicants than a position that might just be on site 100% of the time. Of course, there are definitely positions you can't have to be remote. And I'm assuming if you're logged into this seminar that you definitely have people or portion of your workforce, if not your whole workforce, that is working virtually at least some of the time, if not all the time. So as you probably are experiencing, it is here to stay. And there's some statistics up there on the first screen to show that. And I think the most interesting thing, as Jim alluded to, that shift, that complete shift we've had since before COVID and since COVID, really is telling in that last statistic that 40% of remote capable employees have shifted from working entirely on site to either hybrid or exclusively remote since 2019. And that shows you that we've had such a sea change here. And with that comes great advantages and great challenges, right? So why do we care? We think, well, you know, we're not as much in person. There'll probably be a lot less harassment going on, a lot less discrimination. And unfortunately, that's not proven to be true, because in a 2021 survey, it's a little old and a little dated, but it still holds true, especially given the EEOC statistic that Jim mentioned, that 44% in its one survey had said they experienced harassment at work. And 38% said it was remotely via email or video conference or chat apps. And they said that and then 24% said that the harassment remotely got worse over time. So while we think by being less in person, it would have less risk of dealing with each other in wrongful ways, it actually it isn't. It means that it can still happen. And you know, if you think about it, kind of makes sense. Think about on social media, there are trolls. There are people who just like sit there and they bang out really, you know, offensive or off the cuff remarks, because a lot of times, you know, they get much more brazen online because you don't have to face the person. And I think that happens with email and chats and stuff. We're just kind of going a mile a minute and we say things that we don't necessarily mean. So it's something that is become a problem. And the question is, do we deal with it any differently? Well, in some respects, no, but in some respects, yes. And we're going to go through a lot of that. So what are we talking about when we talk about virtual harassment? It can mean a variety of things. It's something that means, it can be sexist comments or conduct during a video meeting. Think about, you might have a manager who is conducting a meeting, or anyone or a group of managers conducting a meeting. And when the women are speaking, there's one male who might be over speaking them, interrupting them. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time interacting on Zoom a lot of times, or Teams, because I think someone's stopped talking and then I talk and then it's interrupting. And but if that's happening because one particular manager is doing that predominantly with the female coworkers or colleagues, that could be sexist conduct. Or commenting about the background. If we've gotten I would say pretty relaxed, pretty comfortable with Zoom meetings and video conferencing, especially when we're doing it from home. And if something is behind somebody, or if they can see person's bedroom or the person's, intimate living area, that can be a problem if they make comments about that. Or someone has a Confederate flag hanging behind them in their home during a video meeting. That's racist imagery. That could be considered very offensive. So, and it could also be Slack and Teams messages and all kinds of text messaging apps and emails, because a lot of times remote people are talking and communicating via email. In some respects, that's helpful, because you might have good evidence of sexually based comments or inappropriate comments, because it's being done through email and text messages. But sometimes it might also be harder too. And then think about, if they're talking, electronic transmission of offensive images, frequent or unwelcome messages. Maybe a person who works remotely keeps getting pinged by a coworker. How you doing? How you doing? What are you doing now? What are you doing now? It's getting a little creepy seeming. That could be harassment. And then this last one here, inappropriate use of emojis. As one harassment trainer said, an eggplant is not just an eggplant. And there are lots of types of emojis that are inappropriate for use in the workplace. Bananas, whether it be bananas or peaches or some other type of inappropriate emojis. Got to be really careful with how they're used. But they can also be considered harassment or evidence of harassment. Another example was a story a couple of years ago where a manager was conducting a Zoom meeting. And it's not lost to me that we're doing this through Zoom, but at least you only see me, not everybody else. But a manager was conducting a Zoom meeting with his colleagues, and he took a screenshot of his female colleagues on the Zoom meeting, and then he distributed that or disseminated that to some of his friends, and he was making derogatory comments and sexually explicit comments about his female coworkers. Clearly harassing type of behavior. So as we develop new devices and new platforms, we find new ways to be inappropriate with each other. So what the EEOC did in 2023, I think is pretty significant, not just for remote work, but for all issues regarding harassment and discrimination in the workplace. They put together a proposed updated harassment guidance. Now, the EEOC does this occasionally. They put out these enforcement guidances on various topics that they handle. And this one they issued in September of 23. It's still in proposed form, but I think it's probably going to be adopted eventually as finalized form in pretty much the same manner. It's highly interesting. Well, from an employment law standpoint, it's highly interesting, but you might find it interesting too, because I think they use a lot of practical situations and they have a lot of practical advice and ideas, but it's how they're going to analyze harassment cases and harassment complaints and charges that they get in, and how they think they should be investigated. So it's really helpful, because the EEOC really does help define what is acceptable and what employers need to do to have either an affirmative defense to a harassment complaint, or to prevent harassment in the workplace. So I urge you to download a copy of the guidance, read it at your leisure. It's great weekend reading, at least for me it was. But I wanted to pull out some of the interesting points to you about that. First and foremost, it's not just about sex. It is about all types of unlawful harassment based on all other types of protected categories: race, religion, gender, age, disability. And then it also talks about how gender identity harassment is a form of sexual harassment, and can include the intentional and repeated use of a name or pronoun inconsistent with the individual's gender identity. And that's a conversation that I think a lot of workplaces are having nowadays, that employees who prefer to be called a different set of pronouns than what their birth gender is, or prefer to use pronouns such as they, them, can be a bit of a challenge, but it is important that, you know, what they're saying, what the EEOC is saying, look at, if you're inadvertently calling them something else, that's okay. But if it becomes repeated and intentional, then it can be considered harassment based on that person's gender identity. And then context. They talk about that it's a totality of the circumstances when they're analyzing whether something is alleged harassment. And when you think about that, when you're doing an investigation of a harassment complaint, because I always say, you know, you start with some open-ended questions, and as you're interviewing somebody, especially the complainant or the alleged or the accused employee, think about the question of what led up to whatever the conduct was, what led up to him making those comments to you, or what led up to that type of back and forth that you had on the chat, because it's about the totality of the circumstances. And so you always want to talk about, or when you're doing an investigation, get the context of when certain comments are made. What was going on before, what went on after, how's the working relationship between the two people, because that will give you a better idea of how these issues crop up, and whether, to what extent they're serious or severe. And there is no exception to say, well, we're just a crude environment. This is the way we talk. And I saw that a lot, especially like in the healthcare arena. Sometimes humor can get a little off color, but whether it's in the surgery room or in an emergency room, but that's theoretically okay until it's unwelcome, until it's based on a protected status, such as sexual jokes, sexual stories. That's when it's not okay. Okay. And then the EEOC has really come out clearly to say harassment policies should really require supervisors to report harassment when they are aware of it. And in the past, we used to not put that in our harassment policies, because if our supervisors weren't living up to that, it could be seen as basically evidence that they were being negligent. But what we've discovered over time is it's really important to hammer away to supervisors and managers. You're the eyes and ears of the organization. What you see and what you hear is what the organization, what the top brass sees and hears, because you represent the organization to your employees. So it's really important that supervisors and managers, be really specially trained on how to recognize inappropriate conduct. And I say not just harassment, but inappropriate conduct, so that they have the opportunity to stop it before it becomes more severe or more pervasive. So we do want to put that in our policies now, and we want to make sure we're training our supervisors and managers to say, look, this is how you keep an eye out for things. You hear about a situation that could be harassment or inappropriate conduct, you need to report it, and how you report it. And that's going to be important. And especially in the remote workplace, make sure that your supervisors and managers are trained to how to check in with your remote workers. You know, it used to be, you know, we just needed to train our supervisors and managers how to really interact with people, but we need them to understand how to really effectively manage remote workers. They need to be doing check-ins on a regular basis. They need to be, you know, cognizant and careful in how they do their written communications with remote workers, because sometimes that might be the only way, or the predominant way, a remote worker interacts with their supervisor and experiences their supervisor's style and manner. So supervisors really need to be thoughtful in their written communications with remote workers. So the other thing that, a couple of other things that the proposed guidance talked about that I think is important is that first bullet about the fact that conduct that can affect the terms and conditions of employment does not necessarily have to be in a work-related context. It's the biggest myth that I've heard of that whatever happens outside the workplace stays outside the workplace. That's not true, because if it impacts the work environment, if it impacts negatively impacts a person's work environment or terms and conditions of employment, then that outside conduct is got to be covered under your harassment policy. So it's important to have something about that. The EOC had this interesting example in their guidance. This is why I like the guidance, because they do give you good examples that are based on real life cases. And in this one, it talked about how an employee who's of Arab American was subject to ethnic epithets by a coworker who was posting them on the coworker's personal social media page. And the employee either heard about them directly, or he heard other co-workers talking about them and became extremely uncomfortable and offended by them. So even though the conduct wasn't directed right at him, it was still impacted his workplace environment. Another point that the guidance makes that I think is so important when you're training, especially training supervisors, is that if the supervisor is perceived to be harassing a remote worker or any worker, that it is more likely to contribute to a hostile work environment than if coworkers were engaging in the similar type of work, because of that power relationship between a supervisor and an employee, and the supervisor's ability to really affect that person's employment status. And that, I think, is really magnified in a remote worker relationship or situation, because that remote worker the person they may interact the most with could be that's their supervisor. They don't have other coworkers around them that they can turn to and talk to. Maybe they do through Teams or chat or Slack, but really the supervisor becomes so much more important in that situation. Okay. And finally, what I liked about the guidance is that it does say, look, the law doesn't have to be a general civility code. We're not going to prohibit, that run-of-the-mill boorish, juvenile, or annoying behavior. But it must be based on a legally protected status, and it must be more than merely offensive. And I think that's difficult to discern a lot of times. Especially nowadays, I have clients, when they call me with issues, I hear a lot of terms being used in a manner that are very provocative, but not necessarily the right terms of art. People will say, I'm in a hostile work environment. And they may not necessarily be talking about behavior that is sexually based or racially based or based on a protected status. It's just that they feel bullied, or that they feel their supervisor is micromanaging them, and they call that a hostile environment. But they might say, I don't feel safe. I've heard that a lot of times. I just didn't feel safe. I felt threatened. Well, then when you kind of dig into that a little more, you probe a little more, what exactly happened? But you need to know what the actual conduct is. Like, how did you not feel safe? What happened that did not, what were you feeling threatened by? And a lot of times it might come out. I had one situation where the employee is like, I did not feel safe. It was not a safe environment for me. And when you asked that person for more details, it was because she was being counseled or coached about some performance issues that were not going well. And it was her job she felt was being threatened, not her personally being threatened. But it's so important to understand and discern when somebody's saying, I am emotionally upset, but what is it you're emotionally upset about? And the goal in conducting internal reviews is to really, this is helpful information from the EEOC. You have to do enough to arrive at a reasonably fair estimate of the truth. As any of you know who've done any investigations, sometimes you just are never going to know the real truth. And a lot of times you hear one thing and you hear another, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And you have to do your best to try to get to the middle. But it's a reasonably fair estimate of the truth. It doesn't have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the person did harass the other person. But it's a matter of having to really give each side a fair opportunity to say what happened, and give each side a fair opportunity to explain contradictory information. So I had a situation where the person said that, well, we had, I came to his room, or I went to his hotel room because he asked me to, and we had a brief conversation, and that was it. The other person says, well, she was texting me because she wanted to come to my room. And when we came there, I had to tell her that I wasn't interested in her. And so, okay, two different things. So you have to kind of give the other side, well, did he tell you he didn't want to engage in any sexual conduct with you? Did he tell you he didn't want to pursue an affair with you? You have to give each side that fair opportunity to sort of or respond to whatever contradictory information there was. And employers can be held automatically liable for harassing behavior by their proxies or alter egos. And those are fancy terms for basically saying for their supervisors and managers, even if there is no tangible employment action. So even though the person doesn't lose their job, they don't lose a raise, but they are still feeling harassed in a hostile environment because their supervisor is engaging in a lot of sexually inappropriate discussions with them, that can make the employer automatically liable unless they take action, effective and prompt action to stop the harassing behavior. Okay. And then finally, a reminder that the measures to prevent and correct harassment are really an important part of an employer's affirmative defense to harassment claims. And the EEOC lists them: harassment policies, complaint procedures, and training. And we're going to go through each one of those in a lot more detail, but that's what they see as your lines of defense to not just avoiding liability, but also to really prevent harassment from happening in the first place. And this is important. So having a good policy and a complaint procedure by itself is not enough. If you have to implement them when the situations arise, when the employer becomes aware that there is conduct happening that may be a violation of the harassment policy, that they've taken prompt and effective action. That's implementing your procedures and appropriately training your employees. So that's all part of that ability to defend yourself and your company from liability. One last thing before I take a little bit of a break is there's an interesting law that was passed in New Hampshire in January, became effective January of 2023. We had a law that basically has made it a misdemeanor to engage in indecent exposure or lewd behavior in public, in front of somebody in person. And what the law was amended to include was that sending or transmitting an image of yourself engaging in sexually based conduct or exposing your genitals or performing acts of gross lewdness can also be a misdemeanor when the recipient does not consent to receive that image. So I think that's an important thing to mention if you're doing training, because with remote, you have so much texting going on, and text messages, and the practice of sexting is something that can, virtual harassment can involve sexting. I think it's important to sort of make people aware, hey, now it's even a crime to do that with an adult, somebody, that is not consenting to that behavior. So I'm going to stop here for a moment to see if we have any questions. And I think I had seen one. Oh, by the way, I don't think the chat option is available. So if you have a question, please make sure you use the Q&A button on your screen. And the question here is, what if the information is given to a supervisor outside of work? For example, an employee goes to a purely social event with the supervisor, and mentions that another employee has been making potentially unwelcome comments or advances. Great question. And yes, I've had this situation come up, and the answer is supervisor is on notice that something is going on and needs to report it up to HR or report it to upper management. The fact that he heard about it outside the workplace doesn't matter. He now has knowledge that something is going on in the workplace that he needs to deal with. So that's a great question. Another one says, we understand that if a complaint of a hostile work environment is an automatic kickoff of an investigation, when the investigation proves to be a resistance to change, and, oh, hold on a second. When the investigation proves to be a resistance to change in the manager's desire to move office spaces and realignment to the job description, what are next steps? I want to make sure I understand the question that you've done an investigation of a complaint, and now there's a resistance. You've proven that there's a resistance to change and the manager's desire to move office spaces and realign. What are the next steps? I think I would need to know a little bit more about that situation, because it sounds like if you've got an uncooperating manager, if that's the issue, or an uncooperating employee, there are different ways, but it's all going to matter in the context. So I will hold off on that question, and perhaps it's something we can address offline, I should say, so that it's a better understanding. That's where I say it's got to be about the context of what's going on. But it's an intriguing question. Okay. Moving on. So, as I said, we're going to talk about policies, effective complaint process and investigation, and then training. It's all about those three big concepts. Policies. Well, there's a few different policies, especially with remote workplaces, that I think are important. The first one, of course, is the non-harassment policy. And so, as I said, the EEOC guidance really talks nicely about what an effective policy should contain at a minimum. And I'm going to add a couple of little things here, but based on that, and based on my experience of doing a lot of drafting a lot of harassment policies, first, you need a good, clear definition and examples of prohibited conduct. And be sure that your non-harassment policy covers all the legal status, all the legally protected statuses, not just, yes, you want to call out sexual harassment a little bit separately within the policy, but the policy should cover harassment based on race and religion and disability and age and gender identity and all the and national origin. And you want to have good definitions and examples of prohibited conduct, and include, especially if your workplace has a fair portion of remote workers, include examples of virtual harassment. And go back to that other slide I had, which talked about the types of things that could be seen as virtual types of harassment. I think that'll be important. Have a statement that the policy covers off-duty and off-premises conduct if it adversely impacts the workplace. I think that's important. Have multiple avenues for reporting harassment and information, and regarding who to contact and how. And I think that's important, especially for remote workers. They need to have in the policy, who do I go to? And don't just say, report it to human resources. Have perhaps your human resource business partner who can be contacted at a phone number, an email address, but also have it multiple avenues. I know that can be a real challenge in small companies, especially that have sort of flat management structures, but it's important to have at least two people designated. You don't have to mention them by name. You want to mention their job titles. As people that a person can go to report harassment. It's not considered an effective grievance process if you only give them one person or one place to go, because it could be that person or that place that they feel harassed by. But also, you don't want to do just follow your chain of command, because if the first person in that chain of command is their supervisor, and their supervisor is the one that they feel is harassing them, then it's not considered an effective grievance process. But make sure that the people you identify that a person can go to report harassment or report concerns, make sure they're people that have authority to do something about it, because that would be that would be much more effective than having it to be a lower level person that really doesn't have authority to do something. But it's important that you identify those key people especially for remote workers. And have an explanation of what the complaint process is, how they can access it, how they can use it. Make sure there's a strong anti-retaliation statement in there that the company will protect anyone and prohibits retaliation against anyone for raising concerns, for complaining or reporting harassing behavior, and for cooperating in investigations. And that's important too. And also that the part of the complaint, there's another issue with complaint processes. Sometimes you might have people working in other states that the laws in those states require you to have specific types of sexual harassment policies that also include the contact information for the federal and state agencies that a person can go to when they want to file a charge of discrimination or harassment against your company. And so if it's required by law, certainly you need to include those. And I go back and forth whether or not, if you're trying to come up with a harassment policy that's a multi-state policy, say it's covering employees in Mass and New Hampshire, Massachusetts requires that you include the contact information for the Mass Commission Against Discrimination and the EEOC, and whether you want to also include the New Hampshire Human Rights Commission information. Sometimes that might make sense and sometimes not. So it's something that you want to think about when you're putting these policies together. And if it's multi-state, I would say definitely talk with your legal counsel about that and specifically about that. Okay. A couple of other things about your non-harassment policy. Obviously, as I mentioned before, requiring supervisors and managers to report harassment when they become aware of it. This is another area where I've kind of changed my mind about. I used to not put this in harassment policies, but the more I read the EEOC guidance and the more I see situations involving virtual harassment, I think it could be helpful. Encourage employees to retain emails, text messages, and other evidence of offensive conduct, and provide them to the employer to help in an investigation of complaints. And I think that's something that, because with virtual harassment, a lot of times it is going to be in text messages, it is going to be in recorded Zoom meetings, perhaps, or in emails. And I think it's helpful, very helpful for the employer to have that information. I just worked with another employer on a harassment investigation, and a lot of it was text messages between the two people that helped support what the complainant was reported as that when they had conversations and verbal comments, knowing they had been text messaging with each other, those text messages supported what the complainant was saying. So those were important, as well as phone logs. If a person is saying that they're getting a lot of phone calls from somebody, it's helpful to get a copy of the phone logs. The policy should be written in language that's comprehensible to workers. If you've got workers that are not English speaking, really consider getting your policies translated into those languages, or perhaps you have somebody with limited literacy skills. And it would be helpful to have perhaps a simpler version of that policy for those people. And then make sure your policy is widely disseminated, right? You have postings, you have handbook policies, you have training materials, and then reminders. And then keep in mind too, while not in New Hampshire, but both Massachusetts and Maine require employers in those states and with employees in those states to annually disseminate to all employees and the sexual harassment policy. And then in Maine, you also have to do training if you have a workplace that has 15 or more employees there. So make sure, again, you can show that you widely disseminated it. You brought it up in meetings. It shows that you take it seriously. And then I always like to add a statement in my harassment policies that we're going to take corrective action even if the conduct doesn't rise to the level of unlawful harassment, because we want to stop it when it's inappropriate so that it doesn't become so pervasive and severe that it then becomes unlawful. And how you take corrective action will depend upon the severity of what the conduct is that you find happened. Another type of policy that I think is important with remote workers is your appropriate use of IT policy. Most places have this type of policy in their handbook. Sometimes they're pretty long, sometimes they're pretty technical. But I think it's important that you look at your appropriate use of IT policy and think about it from a remote worker standpoint. First thing I think is you want to have a good comprehensive definition of IT resources. It's not just about your email system. It's not just about your internet access. An IT resources policy really covers all your electronic devices, computers, laptops, iPads, tablets, phones, your company phones, printers, your email and voicemail systems, your messaging systems and your messaging apps and your video conference platforms now. So make sure you define what you mean by IT resources, and then use that term throughout your policy. And make sure there's a clear and conspicuous statement up front that employees have no expectation of privacy in their use of the employer's IT resources. Let them know specifically the employer can search, monitor, and access anything created, accessed, stored, and sent through the use of the IT resources, including deleted material. This is the ability to know that in an investigation, that language is really important. So that gives you access, so that means that you can freely go into perhaps people's email accounts, work email accounts, I should say, as well as looking at text messages at recorded Zoom meetings and that type of thing, or Teams meetings. And then make sure there's a statement that all workplace conduct policies, including without limitation, your discrimination, your non-harassment policies, apply to the use of the employer's IT resources, and a statement that all communications through IT resources should make sure be professional and courteous. Okay, I'm going to turn to a couple of more questions here. The first is, would anti-harassment policies be recommended to address receipt of explicit content and threatening messages from external senders? Yes, good point. Your policies, your non-harassment policies should also state that you prohibit harassment of employees by other employees, by supervisors and managers, and by outside third parties, such as vendors or customers or clients, because you do have that legal responsibility. If your employee is receiving those types of messages in their workplace or through their work platforms, that it is your legal obligation to do something about it, to take reasonable measures to protect your employee. So it is, I think I always add that in my anti-harassment policies as well, that it's you prohibit harassment by employees and by third parties. The next question, can an employer have a practice of only allowing remote work within the state of New Hampshire? I'm assuming no. Well, that's a really good question. I would assume maybe, actually, I'll say, because there's a lot of laws and compliance issues and nuances in state laws. And so that you don't have to necessarily subject yourself to those requirements. So if you say, we allow remote work only if you live in New Hampshire, because we are a New Hampshire employer and we are focused on complying with New Hampshire and federal law, I don't see why you couldn't do that, other than it may restrict your ability to fill positions and find good talent. But I think you can do that. It's not a protected status as to which state you live in. But it's a good question. Okay. Finally, there's a remote work policy that you should consider having. Remote work policies, generally, we've been working on these a lot lately. Talking about, excuse me, I'm sorry, talking about things such as, making sure you know what your work schedule is and sticking to your work schedule, being responsive through communications when you're working remotely, being productive, having regular check-ins with your supervisor, making sure you have an appropriate workspace, then you can preserve confidentiality of the work you're doing. But also, in addition to all those, I think the policy should also cover what's appropriate conduct during virtual work meetings. A big issue that I've seen lately is whether or not you have to, can you require that people be on camera during meetings? And the answer is yes. Maybe you have to make an accommodation and an exception for somebody due to a disability. But otherwise, yeah, there should be, you should be, if you're working remotely, you should be available to be on camera during meetings with your colleagues and with your supervisor. And that's going to come up again when I talk about investigation interviews. It's really important in that situation, but also talk about perhaps making sure that your background is not something that would be inappropriate or unprofessional looking, or you have too many personal things behind you. I use this picture behind me because my office in my home is pretty messy. But I think it's, something that maybe sometimes some companies will have company backdrops that they want people to use in their video conferencing. But it's also important to have what's appropriate conduct, just being professional and courteous. What's appropriate communication on email and messaging platforms. Be sure to understand that your video conferences, your messaging platforms are part of the workspace. It's the work environment, and that they should perhaps, and they should make sure that they're being professional and appropriate. Remind people that policies on non-discrimination and non-harassment apply to remote work, and that consider that have a good complaint procedure. It goes back to what I said about in the harassment policy for remote workers, especially. Make sure you give them information as to who they can go to report any concerns they may have, and what that contact information is. That's actually pretty important nowadays. Since that might be the only way they do have an ability to interact with somebody. Okay. Policies. Those to me, I think, are the most important policies when we're talking about preventing virtual harassment, but you might know of others. But now I want to talk about the complaint procedures and investigation of complaints of virtual harassment and for remote workers. So the first thing I want to mention is that, investigation of complaints is really the best tool you have, and it's essential for knowing how to effectively address any inappropriate conduct and to assure that the conduct doesn't happen again. What is your legal obligation when you become aware that there is harassment or inappropriate conduct that may constitute harassment going on? What's your legal obligation? To find out what's going on and to stop it. And that is what drives the whole investigation process, because you just don't know what's going on until you've talked to everybody. And I say that in every one of the investigations that I do, because I do a lot of investigations as an outside investigator for companies. And I always tell my witnesses, look, I'm just here to find out what's been going on, because that's the only way we can come up with the effective way to address the behavior. The employer's not going to know how to effectively, what corrective action is the most effective corrective action unless they know exactly, to the extent they can, know what's going on and how to stop it. So investigations, I have seen them go from a day. Sometimes they last months, depending on who's going to be, what the witnesses are involved, what's involved in gathering the evidence. But the key is to make them prompt and quickly, and that they should start as soon as possible, because you're going to have to start making decisions right away. You might need to know quickly because you act quickly because you have to preserve video meetings or surveillance videos or voice messages or text messages or emails before they get deleted. And you're going to maybe have to decide if you need to involve IT or an outside IT vendor. Because you might have to go through email accounts, people's email Outlook accounts. And then decide if you need to take quick action, immediate action to prevent any further potential misconduct. And that means, do we need to put the person who's being accused on an administrative leave? Do we need to at least perhaps stop any interaction between the two people pending the outcome of the investigation? I've had that happen, that we've had to tell both people, don't interact with each other. We, bring in an in between person, a buffer person that you can go through while we're investigating and figuring out what to do. So you need to make decisions right up front and get that going. Then the next part of that is decide who's going to investigate. And this is sometimes probably the most important thing to do to getting an investigation right. Who can do the investigation? The investigator may not necessarily be the decision maker. In a very small company, that might be one and the same, but if you have the ability to separate the two, it's very helpful. So the investigator is there to do the fact finding. They're there to talk to witnesses, talk to the people, and then report their findings to who the decision maker will be. But decide who's going to be that investigator. It's got to be someone that you feel and is perceived as who's fair, who can be impartial, not necessarily best friends with one or the other parties, not perhaps somebody who's related to any of the other people, but is also a good listener and approachable, has good HR instincts and good HR skills, I like to say. And can it be an internal person, or do you need to have an external investigator? And the times when I'm brought in as an external investigator is because the conduct is the subject of the complaint is a very high level executive, might be the CEO, might be the CFO, and the person in HR reports to the CFO. So you really can't have HR do the investigation. Or it's involving a really highly sensitive issue that you really have to keep it very contained and controlled or discreet as to how this investigation is going to proceed. Or it's going to involve really potentially illegal harassment, and you want to make sure this investigation is done completely, cross the I's, dot the T's, or I should say cross the T's and dot the I's. So you want to bring in somebody who has some legal background to understand what are the issues, what do I need to ask about, and have that person do it. So deciding who's going to be the investigator sometimes is probably the biggest factor in determining if you're going to have a successful investigation. Then plan your investigation. If you decided that you can do the investigation, then that's perfectly fine. Then you need to outline, who do I need to talk to? What are the issues I need to explore here? What are the facts that I need to get? What evidence do I need to collect? If the person who brought the complaint is saying that this person's text messaging me, get a copy of those text messages. If it's a matter of this person is leaving me some really lewd voice messages, get a copy of those voice messages. And it's really important to get the evidence collected. Identify what are the relevant policies that I need to be looking at. Maybe the allegations involve not just harassment, but maybe some other types of wrongdoing. Look at what your policies are and look at what your policies say you're supposed to be doing. Can't tell you, every time I do an investigation, I always say, send me your policies. What are the relevant policies? What do they say? A lot of times they say things like, oh, I'm supposed to do, I'm supposed to make sure I communicate every day with you say something that you need to make sure that you're complying with your policies. And then it's a matter of communicating and with the accused, both the accused and the person who reported. You do need to communicate with the accused that they are the subject of a complaint. That's important. And you need to tell them the reasons behind the investigation that you're doing, what will happen, and what the potential next steps will be. And you need to give them clear warnings about not to contact the person who reported it, not to discuss it with them, and you might have to set boundaries as to how much interaction the two can have, or if you need to you decide it's serious enough, you need to put the accused on an administrative leave, then explain that and explain that the person is not to have contact with other people in the workplace because they don't want to be perceived as influencing witnesses, which would be inappropriate in an investigation. And then you also need to communicate with the remote employee who's been the recipient of the conduct. And I think there, it's almost important to do it a little bit more than you would with an in-person situation, because the remote person could easily feel isolated and out of touch and not know what's going on and wonder, is this being taken seriously? So have set up some good, not frequent, but regular communication with that remote employee to let them know that you're investigating, that you're going to be looking into this, what your potential next steps are. I don't think you can ever guarantee that you will have an answer by a certain time, like we're going to wrap this up tomorrow or next week, but you can say, I'm making progress, I'm moving on this, and ask them, how are they doing? How is it going? Yeah. You want to remind all your parties and witnesses of the need to respect employees' privacy. And you can also restrict them from talking about it during the confidentiality, during the investigation. There is some conflicting guidance between the EEOC and another federal agency called the National Labor Relations Board, which you'll hear more about in the tech exchange, the HR tech HR exchange in April. But the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, takes a position that you can't stop people from talking about the terms and conditions of employment. But the EEOC will say, look, you got to keep investigations confidential. You have to keep allegations of harassment confidential. And certainly if you're going to take personnel actions, you, the employer, need to keep that confidential. So what I try to do is walk a thin line in between. And I remind witnesses, I say, look, we really don't want you talking about this with others. I'm keeping this confidential as far as not telling other people about it, but know that, I need to tell eventually the decision makers what they need to know. But during the investigation, it's really important to protect people's privacies and not influence others. So please keep this confidential while we're investigating it. And then preparing for your interviews. First, your interview is going to be in person. They're going to be through video or phone. In person is the best, always the best to talk to a person in person. But the next best, I would say, is video conferences. I've done plenty of investigations where I'm interviewing people by Zoom or Teams. It's not completely ideal, but I get what I need, especially because I need to see that person on the screen. I was working with a client last week, and they were doing an investigation, and there was a remote worker, and the HR person said, I had to really kind of not start the meeting until I knew she was on the screen, because she was first had her camera shut off. I asked her why, and then I really needed her to have the camera turned on, because she was this person actually that was being interviewed was the accused, and she needed to see the person and be able to see how she reacted to things. So it's important, if you're going to do by video conferencing, that the camera be on, and that you can see them. It's not that the camera's on and you only see half their face or missing part of them, that you see head and shoulders of the person. And then who is it that you want to be talking to? Obviously the complainant, obviously any eyewitnesses or people that the complainant said, hey, I spoke to after this happened, or I've been telling my colleague about this. And then you're going to obviously have an interview with the accused. Be sure to ask about the context, like I mentioned, what led up to the conduct, how's the working relationship between the two people, and conduct follow-up interviews. If you've talked to the complainant, you've talked to witnesses, and then you go and talk to the accused person, and they tell you a completely different story, you need to go back to the complainant and say, okay, well, did I hear that it happened this way, differently from how you described it? Can you clarify any of that for me? And then interviews when you're thinking about how to interview, remember privacy. I love video conferencing because it's pretty private. It's not like I'm coming into a workplace and everybody sees me and who they're talking, who's coming in the conference room to be to have interviews. They can be much more timely and quickly done. But the issue is balancing the effectiveness of them. Make sure you take thorough notes of your interviews or use a note taker. I don't recommend recording a video conference meeting with them. I just don't usually record my interviews anyway, but I take good notes. I go over my notes with the person I've spoken to at the end to make sure I've got it. You can have the witnesses provide you with written statements in addition to your interviews, not in place of, but in addition to your interviews. And the idea is that that you're trying to take reasonable measures to find out what you reasonably could believe is the truth. Okay. Then you want to document your findings. This is something that sometimes it's the step that's missed, and it can be so important. You're trying to get a reasonably fair estimate of the truth. So you really want to document, I find, this is what, so-and-so told me this, but I find this is what happened because, and part of that is making credibility assessments. Why perhaps one person's story was more credible than the other person's story, or is more credible, or why you think one person may not have been telling you the truth because you've heard conflicting information from witnesses. But it's important to document what your findings are. And, maybe you find that there wasn't harassment, but it was inappropriate conduct and should be corrected before it becomes worse. Make sure in sort of at the end of your investigation that you're securing your physical evidence or your digital items. Make sure that they're secured and not lost in the ethernet somewhere. And then communicating your findings to whoever the decision maker is. Maybe it's you, but more often it should be somebody else. And then how much do you tell each person, the complainant and the accused? And decide how much you're going to tell them. Generally, I think an executive summary, not detailed account of who said what, but an executive summary of your findings. You find that the complaint was credible because there was corroborating evidence. You find that inappropriate comments were made. And you don't necessarily even want to say, I find there was unlawful harassment. That can be used against you in a court of law. But you certainly can say, I find that our policy on harassment was violated. And that this is what happened. And then you want to figure out if inappropriate conduct occurred, the disciplinary or corrective action that is implemented, make sure you document that as well. Is it terminating the accused person? Even though you may find that a complaint is credible and supported and true, the question then becomes, well, what's the right action? Is it terminating the person, or do I have to terminate the person? Not necessarily. Certainly if the conduct was severe, pervasive, probably, or blatant violation of your policies, probably. But if the conduct was perhaps maybe a few, he asked the person out several times, they said no a few times, not several times, but maybe they asked the person out twice, and the person said no twice. May not necessarily be terminable offense, but certainly some corrective action might be necessary. And then if you are going to discipline or take corrective action, that should be placed in the accused employee's personnel file. And then all the other documentation goes in a confidential investigation file, separate from personnel files. Okay, let's stop there because it looks like we're getting some questions. The first one, a few here, good questions too. So the first one is, at what point in this process should you also report the situation to your insurance company? Good question. Good question. What that's referring to is a lot of employers nowadays, and I think almost every employer should have what's called an employment practices liability insurance policy. It's a type of business policy on your business. And it's separate from your general liability policy. It's separate from your directors and officers policy. It is specifically geared towards providing your company and perhaps even your executives with insurance coverage for employment-based claims. But it's important in a big requirement of these policies is that you need to put the insurance company on notice of a potential claim as soon as possible. If you don't, and later on you get sued and you turn to your insurance company and say, hey, defend me and give me coverage, they might say, no, you knew about this a long months ago and you didn't tell us about it. So at the point you want to report the situation to your insurance company is when you have a reasonable basis to believe a legal claim is being threatened. And I think it's important that if the alleged conduct, especially if it's alleged sexual harassment or racial harassment or unlawful harassment, unlawfully based harassment, and it's by, a supervisor or a manager, that I think is when you need to put the insurance company on notice. But talk to your legal counsel about that first, but I think it's a good idea to put them on notice. They're not necessarily going to do anything, but they're going to, at that point, tell you whether there would be coverage if there was some type of litigation for that. So I think that's a good question. Next one, how do you navigate keeping the complainant's name anonymous when it's very obvious that they're the one who reported the harassment? John texts an inappropriate picture to Deb. Do you need to keep Deb's name confidential? That's always a concern. We wish we could keep everything confidential, but you really can't. And the reason is you need to do an effective investigation. So it's important that John understand what it was he did that's being complained about. And the only way for John to know that is that he's going to know it's Deb that he sent it to, that is something you need to disclose during your investigation. Two things. One, do you need to tell John that Deb is the one that complained? Maybe not. Maybe you say, we've become aware that there was a picture that you sent to a coworker. Deb, did you send this? Is this yours? In other words, you don't have to say who complained, but you can say, we know we've learned that there was a picture you sent to Deb. Another issue is that everybody you talk to, and especially the accused, you're going to reiterate confidentiality and anti-retaliation. And that's especially important when you're talking to the accused to say, look at John, we're going through this investigation. There was a complaint brought about some emails or pictures you transmitted. And I want to remind you that we take these complaints very seriously and we prohibit any form of retaliation against anybody because they complain or cooperating and participating in this investigation. And when these two people might be working together, it's really important to set the guardrails down for that person and the complainant that we don't want you two interacting with each other or communicating with each other while we're investigating. And then even after the investigation's over, reminder about anti-retaliation. It's not always going to be pretty, but you have that legal obligation to do an effective investigation, and you need to disclose just enough information in order for you to do that effective investigation. And a lot of times that means they're going to know who complained. And if you do, next question, if you're doing a video interview, are you able to ask who else might be in the room off screen? And a follow-up, are you allowed to dictate it? Yes, yes, and yes. This is like any other interview or a work meeting that you want to make sure that you're ensuring privacy. And a lot of times I might say, if the person is talking to me from an office, let's say, can other people hear your conversation with me online? Can are there other people around? The only time you might make an exception is if that person really needs some emotional support and they may want to have a family member join them for emotional support, but they can't engage in the conversation with you. They can just be there as an emotional support. But I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, is there anyone else in the room that can hear what's going on, or anyone else in the house that can hear what's going on? And also if there is that you want to make sure that this is a private conversation. Absolutely. If it's a unionized workplace, you should know, if you're in a unionized workplace, you obviously know that the person has what we call Weingarten rights, which means they can have a union rep with them in a meeting, especially the accused person. But the union rep needs to understand that they are no more than a potted plant in the room. They're not there to speak on behalf of the employee. They're not there to answer the questions themselves. They're there to just be there to support the employee. What is the next question? What is the best way to record your findings and keep all the information together, organized to easily refer back if needed? How to organize programs used, notebooks, just the general organization and storing of the findings? That's a really good question. I know that there are online software, systems, HR software management systems that you can use to sort of upload your findings, upload copies of the information, scanning, the documents or scanning copies of the email threads that you can keep together. There should be a way, the investigation file should be a way for you to really kind of be able to quickly reference, okay, maybe it's I use a G drive at work for my documents, so I have little file folders, and you might have the names of each investigation on there, and it's in a password protected area or secured area of your system. So that I can look through, like maybe I get a complaint about John Smith in 2024. And then they resolved that. Maybe nothing came in. Maybe we weren't able to corroborate, but we reminded everybody of our harassment policy. But then in 2025, I get another complaint against John Smith. I want to be able to look back and see, is there a pattern here? Is this somebody who's had multiple complaints about them? So I do think that that's a really good question on how do I organize my investigation file. And if it's online, password protected area, with file folders for each one, and in there you can save your things. Save your scan and save your notes, or type out your notes and may save them to that system. I hope that answers that question, and that's a good one. What if both parties are behaving inappropriately, then one decides to bring a complaint? That's a great question. Happens a lot, absolutely. Fair investigation hopefully will bring out what the conduct is on both sides. And one party complains, so the accused, you're going to have to take corrective action with the accused. And then you want to think carefully about the action you want to take against the complainant. You want to remind the complainant of your policies. You want to let them know very clearly that any inappropriate conduct needs to stop. And check back a lot. Check back. Complainant is sort of the first one to be protected, and it's difficult to take any disciplinary action against a complainant unless that complainant has been complained about too. But so I always try to be careful, but I do try to find non-disciplinary ways to let that complainant know that their inappropriate conduct is not acceptable either, and that it should stop. So it's a reminder, it's a coaching, something a little less than discipline, but something to get your message across. Do we not have to share details of witness account statements to accused if they are being disciplined, demoted, or terminated, since they are being accused of something that's affecting their livelihood? Do we not have to tell them who has accused them and how it was corroborated? So I think when you're taking, if something has seriously happened that you're going to discipline, demote, or terminate an employee, you don't have to tell them the details of who said what. This is not a criminal procedure. This is not where you have a constitutional right to face your accusers. That's in a criminal court. That is with the government. It is not in a private workplace. A little bit different if you're a public employer, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but a private workplace, you really don't have to tell them anything because they're an at-will employee. But I think it's always appropriate to say why they're being let go or why they're being disciplined. You don't have to say as I said, when you're doing the investigation, you may very well have to disclose who complained about them. You don't necessarily, but I really want to make sure that accused person has an idea of what they did wrong and how it was offensive. Because it needs to be a little bit of a learning experience too, but it also helps that accused person understand you're not just acting arbitrarily either. So it's always a balancing act and it's a fine line, but it can be done. I had a situation where the client was investigating inappropriate conduct by a female against a male coworker. And when the HR person told me the questions she asked the accused person, I said, well, if you terminate her, she's not going to understand why she's being let go because you haven't really dug down into what she did that was offensive. So I do think it's important that they understand what your findings are, not who's necessarily said them. They're going to probably know. They may know who complained because you may have to tell them as part of the investigation, or it may come out as part of the investigation. But it's a matter of saying that it was found to be credible for a number of reasons. So not easy to do, but it's a really judgment call. And certainly feel free, that's when you want to involve legal counsel too, to help. Hey, how's the best way to put the reasons for termination together with this person in a manner that doesn't get other people sort of become targets of that person's anger. And then do you have a harassment investigation checklist workflow that you can share, recommend? I've done them in the past and I keep changing them. But certainly that is something that can be developed, a good checklist. The problem with checklists is if you make them too detailed and you don't follow each and every step of them, somebody may accuse you someday of not following your investigation procedures. So I like checklists, but I also find that I have to always keep customizing them and changing them. But certainly having a general checklist can be helpful. And hopefully the slides give you a little bit of help with that. Another way to sort of put something like that together is to go through a training on investigations. The EEOC does them. Mass Commission Against Discrimination does trainings on effective investigations, and they a lot of times might have good checklists for you and good PowerPoint slides to follow when you're doing that type of thing. Okay. Now, yeah, public employer, let me go back to that other question about public employees. Public employees are a little bit different because they are, as the government, seen as sort of affecting people's due process rights in some respects when it comes to employment discipline and termination issues. But I guess say again, the important thing is to make sure you're following your policies and procedures on termination or discipline. Make sure that if you are giving the accused enough information to understand what they're being terminated for, but not necessarily go into details of who said what to whom. You still don't need to do that. Excuse me. And just make sure that you're following your policies on that. And then in this question, union environment, do we not have to share details of witness account statements to accused if they're being disciplined demoted since they're being accused of something that's affecting? Okay, so back to that question of the public employer. Again, this is not a criminal court of conduct, right? This is, you don't have to share witness statements. They may try to say that I get a copy of the investigation file through a right to know law. We generally treat those as confidential personnel records. And what I will say is, while at the time of termination, you do not have to give them copies of your interview notes or just details of who said what to whom, know that an investigation file, however, is discoverable. That means that if that person brought a lawsuit challenging their termination, or the complainant was dissatisfied with how the complaint was resolved and sues the employer for discrimination. What you put in your investigation file, that all becomes discoverable in a lawsuit. So you need to make sure that only appropriate documents are put in there and not a lot of personal opinions. But again, you don't have to share that with either a public or private workplace employee at time of termination. But again, make sure you're also following your policies. Some towns or counties or government agencies will have very detailed policies about termination, and that it can only be for cause. And you want to make sure you're following those procedures. But you also do want to make sure that if you do have to share more information than you would like to, that it is with the clear disclaimer that any retaliation is prohibited. So I hope that answers the question. It's a good question, but again, I would say talk with legal counsel at the time before you terminate the person to determine how much you can or should disclose to that person. And I guess I just answered this question. Are the documents and investigation documents discoverable? Yes. In cases of Human Rights Commission, yes, those would be discoverable. So that's why it's really good to make sure that they're carefully preserved and that it's really the relevant information that's needed. Okay. Right. Great questions about investigations. I know they're not easy to do. But I, talk with clients through them. I've done them myself, and obviously there are, and there are definitely some trainings out there on how to do appropriate investigations that go beyond what I can cover in this time frame. The last thing I want to talk about is training. This is the last best. This is again what the EEOC is looking to see, that you have done effective training. It's one of the best lines of defense, I think, to hopefully prevent harassment if, again, they're effectively done. What should they include as a minimum? Training should cover what your non-harassment policy is, what your complaint procedure is, as well as an anti-retaliation provision. You should be providing examples of prohibited conduct, especially as well as conduct that may be just inappropriate, not going to be total, not going to rise the level of harassment, but we want to stop it before it becomes pervasive or severe. You want to explain to employees that they have a right to complain. You welcome complaints. You do welcome, you don't welcome the conduct, but you welcome people speaking up about it. If they see it, they become aware of it. And to talk a little bit about what we call bystander obligations. Look, if you see something that you think is inappropriate, what are the strategies you can do to try to stop it, to try to minimize it and make sure that it doesn't continue. And that's especially important for when you do supervisor management training. How can they prevent it? How can they step in and be the supervisor, be the leader to stop that behavior or discourage that type of behavior? And I will say this, when you are doing training, please, please, please do your supervisors and managers first before you do your general employee population. It's got to come from the top and go down. And it's important that supervisors and managers be trained and be ready so that when you've done the general employee population training, it may actually prompt people to come forward and ask questions and concerns. You want your supervisors and managers ready to deal with that. And so you really need to do them. You need to get them trained first. And it's about how to prevent it, how to report and harassment, and how to identify it and how to respond and how to address an employee who's coming to them very upset with a complaint and knowing how to deal with that and report it to HR or to some other manager who handles those issues quickly. And then also how to conduct themselves while that complaint is being investigated. Not that they're the supervisor that's being accused, but if they're the supervisor of a complainant, and you want to make sure that that supervisor is acting appropriately, keeping the information about the complaint confidential, making sure that they're there to support the complainant through an investigation, and support the investigation. So the other thing too is be sure your training is covering all legally protected statuses, as well as non-discrimination and inclusion policies, because trainees can devolve into don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But I really think it's important to also include what you can do. What conduct we do value here, and that is inclusion conduct. That is making sure that you're being sensitive to people's differences. But make sure you're covering all the legal, racial, religion, age, disability. When I do these trainings, I always make sure I have fact scenarios. I always love fact scenarios. Just, it's me talking, but it's also them thinking and engaging. And I always make sure I have it, harassment against a disabled person, harassment against ageism. Is it okay to say, okay, boomer in the workplace? Maybe yes, maybe no. Depends on the context, but that's what I like to do with them, to get them thinking about how to be more sensitive about the things they say. Big point here, tailor the training to your type of workplace and your workforce. And so my son works for a food service company, and he had to do an online mandatory harassment training. And I watched the video, and it was good. It had a lot of good stuff, but it was all about an office environment. All the scenarios they did, the role playing they did, involved people in an office. He works for a food service company in a commercial kitchen, and none of it involved a commercial kitchen. So I thought, well, so what is the employee who works in the commercial kitchen supposed to get out of that? So make sure your training is tailored to your workplace and your workforce. And provide regular training in clear to easy understand style and format. That's why I say I like to use a lot of fact scenarios. But here's the thing, you want to do regular training, and it's expensive and sometimes logistically difficult to always use live trainers. Maybe you want to do training every year or every 2 years. I get that. And so you try to say, all right, what products can I use out there? And there are some decent products. I mean, I haven't researched them completely, but you want to research them. Yeah, there's some good online products out there that have come with quizzes and scenarios. Again, you want to really review them carefully. Say, is this good? Does this apply to my workplace? But it's sort of like quality and quantity, right? I want to have good regular training quantity. So I want to use automated stuff, but I also need it to be quality. And sometimes that means bringing in live trainers, maybe not every year, but periodically, every 2 or every 3 years, bring in a live trainer. And whether it's through a video training or an in-person training, a live trainer is always, I think, really effective. Make sure they're a good trainer, but it's much more immediate. It's much more attention getting if they're a good speaker, to get people engaged. It's the best way to engage people is with a live person. Make sure you document the training session attendance, that it's, and I mean, you certainly can record a training, but with everybody's consent, of course. But if you make sure you're documenting who's attending, have an attendance list, make sure people are signing in, or if it's through a video, that you make sure that you have an ability to confirm that people have attended, and preserve the actual training materials, the slideshows used, the handouts used. I always when I do a training, I make sure I have the employer's policy as part of the handouts that I give to employees, and I go through that policy with them. So I think that's the end there. I'm gonna definitely, we have a little more time for a question. Oh my gosh, it's after 9:30. Liz is gonna kill me. Yeah, and I think we're good. I think those were the end of the questions and the end of my presentation. And here are the credits information. I apologize, I did not put those up before 9:30. But I certainly, if there's anything else that people have, Liz can maybe talk about how, if you have some other follow-up questions, we can talk offline. But here's your credit information. Thank you very much. Again, if you want to know anything more about the Granite State HR conference, let me know and I can get you the right information on that, or about how to nominate somebody for an HR Hero Award. And with that, I will say thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. And I think, I don't know if Liz is wrapping things up or if we're done. Okay. Think we're good. So I will end it and have a great day, everybody. Thank you.